Well, hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a powerful duet, Henry Plant and Opera. I'm Heather Truby Brown, Curator of Education at the Henry Plant Museum. And during this morning's conversation, I invite you to type questions into either the chat box or the comments section, and we look forward to answering those at the end of our conversation. Now, I'm pleased to introduce Beryl Byles. She's a docent at the Henry Plant Museum, and she has graciously agreed to share her knowledge of opera with us this morning as a way of learning more about Henry Plant the man. Opera has always been a part of Beryl's life, and its role has evolved during the course of her lifetime. Professionally, Beryl has had careers as a teacher and a leadership executive coach who, like Plant, actively entwined her passion for opera and in her professional life for 50 years. She was a supernumerary 5 times with 2 different opera companies, one in Dallas and one in Philadelphia. She has provided executive coaching for the Strauss Center for the Performing Arts in Tampa as a volunteer. She has performed with the Master Chorale of Tampa Bay. She has taught Osher Lifelong Learning Institute courses, or OLLI classes, at the University of South Florida on the history of music and opera. And she believes that opera enriches her life. So I think we'll have a fabulous conversation hearing what she has to say in her relation with Plant's relationship to opera. But before we can start exploring how Plant incorporated opera into his personal and professional life, Beryl, I think it would help if our visitors, our viewers, had an idea of what it was like to experience opera during the Victorian time. What was the Victorian opera scene like? Can you paint a picture for us of what Plant and his social peers would have been experiencing in the late 1800s?
Absolutely. It was quite a lovely time in a lot of ways, especially, excuse me, on the surface, as the movie, The Age of Innocence, beautifully depicted for us to be able to see how elegantly people were always dressed and interacting with one another. People would go to the opera as a true social event. It was the place to see and be seen. I think maybe that term might have originated with that particular idea. And even though they were, quote, audience, which of course means they were supposed to be listening, people who went to the opera in Victorian times did not pay very much attention at all to the stage. They were there mostly to be able to interact with one another, to see who was there, how they were dressed, who was being a little more attentive to someone than someone else. And so opera was literally, the stage was background music for them. Of course, opera was a reality and a very important social experience, as I said, in Philadelphia, in New York, and in Paris, not so much London at the time. And there were very interesting experiences. You know, Paris at the time, of course, was considered to be the capital of the world. I mean, it was where sophistication lived. Excuse me. Fashion was at its height, and everybody else modeled what went on in Paris. And when people wanted to experience, quote, the good life, they would go to Paris. And so sorry, but we have a wonderful image. I love this image of a plant you had up. But yes, this painting by Mary Cassatt is her sister, actually, who modeled for her, and she calls it The Woman with a Pearl Necklace in the Loge. Now, she's quite elegantly dressed, as a lady would be, with her gloves and her fan and her pearls, and her hair is swept up. But from what I can tell, Heather, she's not looking at the stage, which is typical of what we know about opera at the time. How they determined what their preferences were is a bit of a curiosity to me, because of course today, if anyone even dares to turn a page of a program, they create ire among their fellow audience members. So today one must be very quiet. But there is a gorgeous scene by Mary Cassatt of what opera looked like at that time. See the gorgeous chandelier? This would have been, as a matter of fact, in the main opera house in Paris, which was the Palais Garnier. I don't know if this is a good time to show a photo of the Palais Garnier, but people would know what that opera house looks like, because it's now on a tour. If you're doing Paris, it's one of the things you want to see is the opera house, which was the Palais Garnier, designed by the architect Garnier.
And Beryl, we can certainly get to that. I have a couple slides in between.
No problem.
This one and that one.
Okay.
But as you were talking about how people dressed and the fact that it was a social experience to see and be seen, perhaps you could speak a little bit about what a night at the opera would have been like. I mean, you mentioned clearly she's not looking at the opera. Is this lady possibly with a gentleman? Did couples go out together, or was there some social etiquette that dictated who and how they attended the opera?
Okay, wonderful. Typically in Paris now, I don't know if this were true in the other opera houses, but in Paris, it was a given that women would go to the first act. And so likely she's seated in that box with some of her friends who would be women. In the meantime, men would be in a nearby cafe having their drinks and smoking their cigars, because for some reason they had no interest in the first act. Now, everything in the opera at that time was very measured. I mean, there were certain requirements about how long an act would last, etc. And one of the requirements was that in the second act, there would always be a ballet. Now, oh, there we are, good. And so the men would go to the opera house for the second act. And they, as a matter of fact, had a special entrance, and it would take them near the wings of the stage where they could see the ballet dancers about to perform. And it was a practice at the time that they would be literally ogling those young girls to be considering who might be their next paramour. And we know that Degas had a particular interest in these girls. I think he pitied them, Heather, because I can almost see pathos in his paintings. And this statue of, he calls it a little dancer. She's only 14 years old. There does not, joy does not emanate from her body at all. And so it was a very difficult life. It was an opportunity for girls to be able to leave their very poor families and maybe send money back home. But that was a practice at the time. Now, the way it was done, if you will, in Philadelphia was that after the first act, it may have been the second act, and intermission, likely after the second act, the women would go to their area of the theater to have tea and probably use the ladies' room and freshen up their makeup. The men went downstairs into what at the time was called the canteen. This is in the Academy of Music in Philadelphia, which is still very active. It's the only opera house still being used as an opera house in this country. And there is a bar downstairs now. But the men would go downstairs, and that's where they would be interacting with the ballet dancers. And so apparently that's been the story for ballet dancers in opera and men in at least these two different cities.
Well, that's very fascinating. In terms of what date night might have looked like in the Victorian era.
Now let's go back. I want to then interrupt here and say, one of the interesting things, of course, about Paris at the time is opera was big. I mean, it was hot. And there were about 5 different opera houses. And the one that is pictured in the Cassatt painting, as I said, is the Palais Garnier. But there were several others. And the venue itself tended to suggest the type of opera that you would see. And for example, you would go to the main opera house to see the big operas, the grand operas. And in fact, spectacle was a given in those operas. Oh, there we are. So now that is the that is another building that Garnier.
Beryl, I apologize for interrupting. There we go.
There we go. Okay, the Palais Garnier, look at that. Well, how would you not get dressed up if you were going to a gorgeous building like that? So Garnier was an architect, very well known, very, very well respected. And he designed this I think it opened in the mid 1800s. And then he also, oops, yep, that's the interior. Look at that. It reminds me of Versailles. actually. And that's the interior, one part of the Palais Garnier. And then the other one you had, Heather, oh, that's the stage at the Palais Garnier. Isn't that glorious? So it's in one of those balconies where the woman with the pearl necklace was sitting. And then are you going to go to the Monte Carlo?
Yes.
Okay.
So we'll back up.
There we are. Okay. And you said this is the building that is usually shown in James Bond movies?
Yes, for all of you Bond folks out there who might be tuning in, you might recognize this from the James Bond series when he travels to Monte Carlo.
Very good. It was Royale, they called
Yes.
it, right? Casino Royale. Okay, fine. And so because Garnier was so highly regarded, then he was invited to design the casino in Monte Carlo, which of course still very much stands. And I think you have a photo of the interior as well. Yes, look at that. Oh my goodness. How would you not get dressed up? You can't go there in jeans. That's all there is to it. Anyway, so opera was hot in Paris. There were 5 different opera companies, and the type of opera at the Palais Garnier, as I said, would have been the grand operas. And some of them we are still enjoying today. For example, Norma by Bellini, in which the famous aria Casta Diva takes place, would have been performed there. Faust by Gounod would have been performed there. In fact, it was the opera that was the daily live stream from the Met last Saturday. And so it's still very much in the current repertoire. Manon by Massenet is another depiction of the vulnerability of women. And it recently was done with a new soprano who a few of us here in Tampa are really following. Lisette Oropesa was just wonderful as Manon. And then an opera, Lakmé by Leo Delibes, has a famous aria it's a duet by 2 women, and American Airlines used it as their background music for a long time. And then another opera by Saint-Saëns. People will know that name maybe from his orchestral work, The Carnival of the Animals, but his opera, Samson and Dalila, has the ultimate seduction aria. So those would have been the kinds of operas in the Palais Garnier. I would say that they were probably not as interesting to plant because they are kind of the caviar of opera. You have to have a taste that is, it's developed. It's an acquired taste, as they say. But then there was another opera called the Opéra Comique. Again, very definite expectations about what those operas were going to be. They were typically comique. They were comedic. So as we talked about before, the definition of opera per se, pure opera, is all sung. There is no spoken dialogue. In those big grand operas at the Palais Garnier, there is no spoken dialogue. Everything is sung. But at the Opéra Comique, there might be some dialogue. And in fact, the opera Carmen, which of course is still very much in today's repertoire, there is some dialogue. I mean, you can hardly notice it because you're so wrapped up in the gorgeous music that Bizet provides. Another opera that was done at the Opéra Comique is La Fille du Régiment. And it was commissioned for Paris it was commissioned that Donizetti would write it. And that's another story. And we'll talk about that later, right? In terms of a painting that is in the museum. But the opera at Opéra Comique would have been even considered to be kind of family oriented. But then I'd like to go to another opera house called the Théâtre de Bouffe Parisien. And it was started by Offenbach, Jacques Offenbach, probably a name people know. He was from Germany, and he had a very special idea about the kind of operas he wanted to write. But they were not the kinds of operas that the Opéra Comique were willing to stage. And so he started his own, thank you very much. And it was a small opera house, and I think that's where Plant would have experienced operas like La Mascotte, as well as L'Olivette. And those names, as you know, became very important. They were performed in 1879 and in 1880. And a few years later, Plant named two of his ships after those two operas. And specifically in 1885, he commissioned the Mascotte to be built, and it was 884 tons. In 1887, he commissioned the Olivette to be built, and it was almost double the size, 1676 tons. And it's interesting to me to consider that that's even before he began thinking about maybe and constructing the Tampa Bay Hotel, of course, in 1891. Now, La Mascotte, what a fun poster from the opera itself. It was music. You see at the bottom of the screen, it says Musique de Audrin. So he was the composer. And the two individuals who wrote the script are on the other side, Chivot and Duro. Now, this poster just makes me smile because the story is that this young girl is a good luck charm. This is set in Provence, and there is a word in provincial French that says mascotte. It's where we get the term mascot, and it means something of good luck, right? And so she was considered to be a good luck charm. And so a prince learned about her, and he was down on his luck. Nothing was working for him. This is the plot now of the opera, that a prince who was down on his luck, none of his commercial interests were working. His military exploits were all disasters. And he learns about her, and he brings her to court, and he begins paying a lot of attention to her. And so people think that she is his mistress, but no, no, no. He's not interested in her as a potential lover, because the deal is that she's only a good luck charm as long as she's a virgin. And so he's paying close attention to her because he's having good luck, and he doesn't want his luck to be in any way challenged. Of course, in the opera, there is someone who comes along who loves her and she loves him, and that complicates the reality, which makes the opera a lot of fun, actually.
And excuse me, Beryl, so sorry. I lost my internet connection there for a moment. So perhaps you touched on this, but I wanted to go back before we get too far into specifically Plant and his interest in the operettas. Is you had started to mention when we were looking at the images of the grand opera houses in Paris, that there were different operas that the opera houses had been designed specifically for certain operas, that styles of opera. Perhaps you might touch on that, and that might get at a little bit more of the nuanced difference between the grand opera and the ones that Plant seemed to be most enjoying in his life, which were the operettas.
Right, and I think maybe I had listed several of the operas that would have been considered grand opera in the Palais Garnier, the main opera house. And that Opera Comique was another one that probably he would have enjoyed, but it was the operas at the opera house that Offenbach had begun, the Théâtre de Bouffe Parisien, which provided the lighter opera, what we might today call operetta or opera buffa, which is a fun term. Now, there was another opera house as well that a bit earlier had been started, and it was called the Théâtre de Variété. And it was where Offenbach produced the opera La Grande Duchesse, there we are, de Gerolstein. And this was a military satire about Catherine the Great. Now, I don't know how they got away with that, Heather, but apparently they did. Satire has been with us for a long time. It was produced in 1867, and ever commercially oriented, Offenbach deliberately mounted this opera, wrote it and mounted it to coincide with a Paris exhibition of that year. And he knew that all the heads of state from all the different countries in Europe were going to be coming. And as a matter of fact, we know that the Grand Duke from Russia attended, the son of Victoria attended, and many other of the heads of state. And so it was a huge success. Now, I'm not sure that Plant was there at the time. I don't know that. But he certainly would have known about this opera. And of course, it's not just one and done. You know, operas are presented over and over and over. So it would have been in the repertoire, that he would have experienced.
And so thinking about Plant and what he would have experienced, living in New York, he most likely would have gone to see the New York Opera, but it seems as if the French operas were what influenced him the most. And in looking at that with some of these titles, I believe you were mentioning that a little while earlier, how he was incorporating the French operas into his life. That seemed to be what he most resonated with him.
It's only my perception, of course, Heather, but when I think of the man as a boy, his life growing up in almost puritanical New England in Connecticut, it was a very simple life, if not even perhaps severe. And it just seems to me that when he encountered the lighthearted, almost frivolity of French opera, it resonated with him. Plus, it was an enormous balance in his life. By the time he's in his 50s, and he's a very successful man, he's got prestige addresses for his business and his home in the mid 1700s, in the mid 1870s. And so he's now, you know, ready to be able to add another dimension to his life. And French opera, especially these lighthearted operas, just seem to resonate with him. And as we mentioned before, two of the previous operas we mentioned were named Ships. There we are. And at a later point in time, almost 10 years later, 1895, of course, the Tampa Bay Hotel has already been built by this time. He commissions the largest and most luxurious of ships at the time, called La Grande Duchesse, and she was. And apparently Margaret even helped with the furnishings. So it was a very upscale and elegant experience to be able to sail on La Grande Duchesse.
Yes, and we have another image here. And because these were such accomplishments for the Plant system, building the largest ship at the time of such grandeur, Plant definitely wanted to promote that. And so he used images of this and some of his other steamships on his marketing materials and on luggage tags and things like that. So we have this example. And then here is an image of the mascot, which Beryl, I believe you already touched a little bit on that. And then the Olivette.
Wonderful. You know, he was such an entrepreneur, Heather. I mean, you know, it seems to me he would have been a very interesting man to have dinner with, because his mind was always working. And the way he connected dots to be able to become inspired, and entertained and intrigued, I think, as well, by French opera, and then bringing it into his work. You know, I can also maybe stretch a point a bit and suggest that the Tampa Bay Hotel was his definition of spectacle. You know, he would have known about French opera in the main opera house and might have gone to a few of those. So he learned from that too, that spectacle mattered. It got people's attention, for goodness sakes. And I think that was somewhat on his mind when he decided on the design and the idea of the Tampa Bay Hotel, which of course it was considered very exotic at the time, and a unique, interesting, entertaining way for people to come during the season. And of course, he incorporated entertainment. We know he had a full orchestra on staff during the season. And we know that opera was presented. I don't know if it were a full-fledged opera, but it might well have been a concert of opera arias or something like that. Because in his first Magic Kingdom in Florida, as you know, it is sometimes called, he would have literally pulled out all the stops, to use an organ analogy, to be able to make it something that was a very memorable, exciting, special experience. And from all we know, it was a very special place to him. He seemed to really love being able to have it as a part of his life, which of course he financed right out of his own pocket. There was no ending to the size of the check apparently he was willing to write for the Tampa Bay Hotel.
And I think you make an interesting point there about the Tampa Bay Hotel, as well as his steamships, that idea of the grandeur, the opulence. It was the Gilded Age. And so how all these things connect. And then in opera, it was over the top. It was spectacle, as you mentioned. So making all these connections throughout and being a product of the era and going with that is definitely seen in this. Now, Beryl, and here we have one last image of the Olivet. And before I get to the last slide, Beryl, in a conversation, we had talked about the meaning, the origin of the word opera and what that means. I wonder if you might speak a little bit about that and what some of your observations are in connecting that with Plant.
Okay, fine. Of course. The word opera is the plural form of the word opus, an Italian word for work. And I know at times we've heard people refer to the work of an artist, for example, as that person's, quote, opus. And so opera is the plural form of that work. Well, for Plant, work was very serious stuff. I mean, he literally made his career. It was, to me, very impressive about how deliberate he was at seeing opportunities, seizing opportunities, and enlarging them into something that was profitable and that would then lead to something else. And so his definition of work, to me, corresponded with the whole idea of something that mattered. It mattered to him. It was not a frivolous enterprise for him to be expanding his shipping line or expanding his railroad line. I mean, I always thought how fascinating it was that he began to buy smaller railroad companies and adjusting their railroad track to be something that would become uniform. So they might have had different size gauge, I think it's called, tracks. And so people would only be able to ride X amount of a distance on one railroad. They'd have to get off, schlep all their stuff to another railroad that had a different size track. And so he would buy these and make the tracks all uniform so that what is it? His railroad could go from New York to Brazil, I think I read one place. So he was very entrepreneurial in the way that he worked, and work was an important expression for him.
And I think you're right. He was a man, he was hardworking. He definitely was one who put every effort into the quality of his work. And it's interesting in talking about some of the, thinking back to the opera, the light opera, the operettas that he seemed to enjoy, the ones that didn't have the tragedy at the end, that maybe he enjoyed that because that offered him, that was the form of escape that he liked. He wanted lighthearted, and perhaps that's why he particularly enjoyed those. At least they seem to be meaningful enough to him that he named some ships after those operettas. And thinking then about seeing representations of opera in his Tampa Bay hotel. Here we have a picture of the writing and reading room. It's a present day image, but if you look at the red box, you'll see the painting that is on the right hand of the screen, hopefully. Beryl, could you speak about that?
Absolutely. I think you have a close-up of that, Heather.
Yes, can
you?
I
see it? Oh, it's on the other side of the screen. Okay, fine. Okay. I'm delighted to talk about that. When I first saw this painting, I got excited in the museum because it was unexpected. It was just like a treat that showed up. So this young girl seems to be in some type of military dress, as you can see, and very much French. And she's prominent, of course. So this is from the opera, La Fille du Régiment, the daughter of the regiment that I mentioned earlier. Donizetti wrote it. So he's Italian. It's written, it had been, the story was in French, and so he sets the French text to music. So sometimes it's confusing to people about what something, what language is used that is sung, whereas the composer might be something else. So it's an Italian composer writing music for a French opera that is, of course, sung in French. So this is from the perspective of the soldiers. And the plot of this is that this is Marie, and she was a foundling. So she was found as a baby by this group of French soldiers, this regiment. They adopt her and they raise her as their own. And so now here she is, a young girl, a young woman, and she's marriageable age. And as you can see, there's this rather hapless looking man in gray, interestingly, standing just behind her, looking longingly at her, but no strength in him whatsoever. This is from the perspective of the soldiers. They don't see any man as good enough for their Marie. And so there is the plot of the story. Now, she's rather taken with him too. And so his name is Tonio, by the way, and they are on assignment in the Swiss Alps near Italy. So we also have that little drama going on. But he's even willing to join the troops because they had said nobody but one of their own, one of the regiment could marry her. And so he's even willing to join the regiment, but then that doesn't work out. Anyway, it's a very fun, very lighthearted, delightful opera. And for opera people, it is one of the treats to be able to hear the, in the first act actually, the aria called Ah mes amis, Ah my friends, in which the tenor has 9 high C's. This is a feat. Pavarotti, for example, was in this opera one time. And in recent years, one convention that has always been true for opera has been broken. And that is, it's so exciting to be able to hear this aria that sometimes the audience will get up on its feet, applaud, cheer, yell, and want to have an encore in the middle of the opera. It's called in situ. And so sometimes you can see that the tenor and the conductor are looking at one another. Should we, shouldn't we? And sometimes they will literally repeat it. They will do an encore right there on the spot. And Heather, people cheer and carry on like they do when a touchdown has been made or something like that. It's very exciting stuff that is what opera is. I mean, you go to opera for the excitement of it all, and it's almost always all about the singing.
Well, Beryl, that is certainly fascinating. And I wonder if as people visit the museum when they're able to again and going through, if they have such a knowledge of opera or even a specific opera, if they might find other evidence of opera throughout the museum in the artwork. So that would be interesting to explore. Well, that's the last slide I have. Just wondered, Beryl, if you had any other final thoughts to share on Plant and his connection, his interest in music and opera specifically, before we start looking at questions.
Well, I just find it tremendously interesting that an individual like Henry Plant would be open to growth and development and the willingness to look at the world through new eyes. Because I'm sure that none of his childhood chums who were still in Connecticut, very much relegated to the lifestyle that they had known as children, I'm sure they couldn't relate to him anymore as this world traveler, almost bon vivant, who is knowledgeable about and conversant about and delighted in opera. So growth and helping individuals find their own truth was always important to me as an executive coach. And so I love to see how this man became the best that he could be by being open to new experiences and new ideas. And that's, to me, incorporated into what we get to experience of him in what he has left us.
Well, I think that's a wonderful observation. And I know that as a person in Plant's biography, he did mention that music had always been something that was important in his life. One of his earliest memories is of his mother singing, and that seemed to stay with him and move him, and be something so important that years later, at the end of his life, when he was working on his biography, that he recalled that. So I think music was always important to him, and in different formats of music, because as you mentioned, in the Tampa Bay Hotel, there was the orchestra. He also had an orchestrion that would play music, and so it was certainly something that was important to him. So,
well, and you know, Heather, just one additional observation anyway. A recent article in the Wall Street Journal noted how right now, during this pandemic, when there is uncertainty, there is disorder, people are turning to music, especially classical music and opera, to be able to not only experience beauty, but to experience order and elegance in predictable, enriching, even inspiring ways. So music is our friend, and it really can enrich and enlarge our lives. And it certainly, it did for Henry Plant.
Well, this has just been a very fascinating conversation, Beryl. I so appreciate you sharing with us. I'm going to stop my screen share now, and I believe we have two questions that, while I'm starting to look through the questions that are coming in, I have two questions that hopefully our viewers can now see on their screen. If they'll just take a few seconds to answer those, that would be great. And for those of you who are joining us on Facebook, feel free to respond in the comments section. You won't be able to actually do the poll, but you can definitely let us know your thoughts in the comments section. So give it just a few more seconds for anyone who would like to respond, and I will start looking through our questions. One was, did Margaret introduce Henry to opera? What do you think about that?
That is my best guess, as a matter of fact, because he married Margaret when he was 54 years old. He had been a widow for 11 years by that time. And from what I know about him, Heather, he was busy before that time. I mean, he started work as a teenager, I think 15 years old, 16. And he was just busy growing a business very impressively. And so I think by the time he met Margaret in his mid-50s, he's now, as I said, established with prestige addresses in New York. And I think she opens his perspective about what else there is. Now, what I know about her is that she was a New Yorker. She would have been very well bred and educated and knowledgeable about the arts. And so I think she was probably the portal for him into understanding the richness of the world of the arts. Now, he had gone to Paris himself because he had traveled before, but I don't know if he would have gone to the opera. And if he had, you know, when you go to I love to take people to the opera for the first time, because I really do. It's just one of my fun things to do. Because I think they need to understand what they're experiencing. Otherwise, it's all alien and weird. And no. You have to be able to enter into it and really let it kind of fall, just embrace you. And I think that she helped him to be able to do that.
Well, and another question that came in, and I don't know that you know the answer to this. I'm not aware of anything about this, but did Henry Plant sponsor an opera house anywhere?
I don't think so, but I don't know that.
I don't know that either. There is in Cantor Brown's new book, he talks about Henry Plant and his relationship with with opera. And in one of those areas, he mentions that Plant was possibly thinking about doing something with opera in Cuba, and that I'm not really sure about, but I know that that is mentioned in Cantor's new book with in reference to Plant. And then another question that came in from Facebook, it sounds as though the Olivet, the Mascot, and La Grande Duchess are not considered high operas. One, is that true? I think you touched on the difference between opera comique and opera, but then are they still performed today?
Very good question. Not very much. The La Grande Duchesse is performed more than Mascot or Olivet. And I was recently reading that Mascot was recently presented. It's important to realize that when opera began in the late 1500s in Florence, it was an idea of the camerata, the intelligentsia of the time, that since we now have drama and we have dance and we have music and orchestration, et cetera, we have all the ingredients of opera. What about putting them together? And so they commissioned someone to write music for a Greek play. So opera for the Italians was serious stuff. I mean, that's hard to maybe put together, but it was very serious stuff. And so then when opera started traveling to other places, by the time it got to France in the late 1600s and then evolved itself into opera comique of the mid 1800s, it had evolved. The French were not interested in the same mythological what do you call it, settings or plays. That was not their interest. They were interested in history for sure. They were fascinated by royalty and how that would play on stage, but they had a different sentiment or a sentimentality about it. And so I think I got lost here, but I don't think we could call these operas grand opera, because grand opera tends to deal with heavier, more, if you will, tragic themes, whereas these are deliberately lighthearted.
And I know that in our side conversation and in preparing for this, Gilbert and Sullivan is a popular one for light opera operettas.
Well, it's interesting, Heather, that you mentioned that, because Offenbach, I think Gilbert and Sullivan had visited Offenbach and learned about his operas, and so their version, the British version, the Gilbert and Sullivan operettas, were the evolution from the Offenbach operas or operettas. I mean, it keeps on evolving. We could also make a case that today, Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton is today's version of Offenbach, because it's the strong pattern. It's a much more serious theme, of course, but the type of presentation that's very, very arresting and compelling and interesting, and of course the patter comes very much from, it's a descendant of Gilbert and Sullivan's patter.
Very interesting. Do you know of a good place to listen to these operas online?
Well, I just go to YouTube and find whatever is available. I keep searching until I hear something that seems to be of interest to me, but I go to YouTube for sure.
Okay. And I'm just scrolling through here. So someone asked, where did hotel guests, excuse me, listen to music and operas at the Tampa Bay Hotel? Excuse me. We, of course, had the music room, where that was where the orchestra would perform. And then the casino, there would be musical performances in the casino. And then how many could attend at one time? I honestly don't know the capacity of the music room. I know today it's about 150, but, and that's seated, obviously not if there were to be a dance. And then the casino advertisements mentioned a seating capacity of 2,000. So quite a large theater seating.
Mhm.
especially for Tampa at that time.
That's what I'm thinking, because when the hotel was full, it was maybe what, 1,000 guests?
The About that, the room's 511 rooms, and so if you're
Mhm.
thinking double occupancy, yes.
Hmm. I mean, there would have been some locals who would have come, but there were not many.
And so I believe it, a lot of people, I'm looking at one of the comments that came in, many of our Facebook viewers liked your comparison to Hamilton. So thank you. I'm so glad you shared that. We did have a question about your background, Beryl, and opera, wondering if you had performed as a supernumerary in any of Plant's, any of the operas that Plant enjoyed. But I think it might be helpful for some of our viewers if you explain what a supernumerary is. And I will screen share because I have this fabulous image.
Ah, okay. A supernumerary is simply an extra in opera. And this is a photo of when I was a supernumerary in the Dallas Opera. I think this was in the late 70s, maybe 78, 79. And it was the opera Manon Lescaut, which in fact is going to be the nightly stream, I think tomorrow night by the Metropolitan Opera. And I had a wonderful, wonderful time. I mean, this is not the kind of makeup I usually wear, nor the type of dress that I would typically dress, but it was in Manon Lescaut, and it was a fallen woman who no longer had a husband, and she was now relegated to being a prostitute, which was true for French women. And she was now being sent to Louisiana. This is a Puccini opera. He called it the desert of Louisiana, which simply meant that he had never been there, of course. So she was being sent to New Orleans, where the French were trying to get a new colony settled. And these two men were French soldiers who were escorting me to the ship. Now we're off stage here and we're laughing and we're having a great time. But I will tell you, Heather, that I would go down early just to get into costume. And then I would wander about and talk to everybody and enjoy being able to be a part of the wonderful world of opera. And it was almost magical to be able to experience how an opera came together. You can stop me if we need to stop here, but to put an opera together, everybody comes, all the principal characters come knowing their part. They have already sung it probably several other times. It becomes the director's job, who's responsible for everything we see on stage, just as the conductor is responsible for everything we hear, because he or she is following the score, which is God in opera. But the director is the one who serves as glue to bring the whole production together in the way he or she thinks it should look. So I had a wonderful time. I was in 5 different operas as a supernumerary, and one was better than the next one. It was great fun.
Well, Beryl, thank you so much for sharing that story. It looks like those are all the questions that we've had come in. And so what a wonderful and interesting conversation. And so thank you for sharing your information with us. Thank you to everyone who joined us this morning, and for those who shared your conversations, your comments, and the poll. I'd like to invite everybody to join us on Sunday at 2 for our dramatic reading of Otis Friedman, the head waiter at the Tampa Bay Hotel. And so again, Beryl, thank you.
You're very, very welcome.
Go listen to music, everyone.
It's exactly what I'm going to do.
Excellent. Enjoy your day.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks.